The secret you've kept buried in your heart for so long is about to be revealed. The rustling in the air, and an old portrait with a shimmering tale, one that was feared by some, and a painful memory for others. If you think your pain is over, you'll have to think again, because the real beginning of this story starts now, and in its midst the truth will shatter your old dreams, forcing you to face your deepest fear. The unnamed portrait in the West Wing. It had been a cruel, lingering spring in the village of Marley, the kind that seeped into the bones and clung to the skin like a whisper of something half forgotten. The ground squelched beneath heavy boots, not from the cheerful rains of renewal, but from storms that left the earth sodden and sour, soaking rose petals, until they wept their color into the soil. The air was thick with the scent of rot and wet stone, and grey clouds curled over the village, like watching eyes that never blinked. Yet still, life pulsed in Marley's crooked lanes. Window boxes overflowed defiantly with drenched petunias. Lace curtains shivered as if in anticipation, and hushed gossip slid like smoke through half-shut doors, always curling toward the same name. At the very center of this whispered world loomed Glenwood Hall, once proud, now crumbling, a manor of aging grandeur, its ivy-choked walls hiding broken glass, and the echoes of footsteps that had not walked there in decades. Once it had hosted poets and philosophers, artists and orators, but now it belonged to Lady Lavinia Gray, a woman of delicate menace, sharp cheekbones like fine china, a gaze like ice on fire, and a voice that still sliced through silence even as her failing legs betrayed her. Every spring, the hall stirred for a single night. The infamous artists' soiree, invitations, penned in haunting violet ink, arrived at select homes like omens, and even the uninvited acted as if declining was an act of grace. The night always unfolded with eerie symmetry. Wine, whispers, chamber music drifting like ghosts through velvet-draped halls, and finally the unveiling of a new portrait in Lady Lavinia's deeply unsettling private gallery, a collection that seemed less curated than conjured. Miss Marple, not quite the village center, but always orbiting it, had never missed a single soiree, not out of affection for art, but because she believed no place revealed more truth than a room laced with drink, secrets, and the illusion of privacy. On this particular evening, Glenwood Hall smelled faintly of lavender polish, worn wood, and something metallic beneath it all. The quartet played something melancholic and easy to forget, while guests gathered under oil-painted eyes of long-dead ancestors, and ladies frozen in expressions that made one uneasy if stared at too long. Miss Marple arrived alone, her shawl the color of fading lilacs, and was greeted by Elsie, the maid who'd outlived generations of whispers. Lady Lavinia insists you have your tea just as you like it, Miss Lemon. No sugar, she said breathlessly, cheeks flushed not just from errands, but perhaps from fear. Marla smiled, her eyes already scanning the faces. Cynthia Marsh, the vicar's niece with eyes too bright for someone raised in shadow. Marcus Fielding, Lavinia's godson, his London suit pressed so precisely, it looked like armor. And Dr. Quinton, calm and silver-haired, the kind of man who'd know how many ribs you could break before you stopped breathing. Soon the guests were ushered into the West Wing, to a gallery that felt more like a corridor between worlds, dimly lit by sconces and trembling candlelight. At the far end stood the new piece, veiled in crimson velvet, like something dangerous being held back. Lady Lavinia entered last, frail yet regal, her frame supported lightly by Marcus, though her eyes needed no assistance to dominate the room. This year's edition, she said, her voice thin but sharp, is unlike any before. It came to me strangely. No name, no origin, but it called to me. Her fingers tugged the drape with dramatic grace, and silence fell like a stone. The portrait revealed a woman who was not beautiful, not even familiar, but arresting. Her eyes seemed too alive for oil and canvas, her lips curved just slightly, as though she knew something about you that you didn't. Her dress, deep plum and severe, felt out of place in both time and taste, and the background behind her shimmered somewhere between forest dusk and a parlor-turned tomb. But it was her eyes, those eyes, that caused a shift in the room, not because they appeared to follow you, but because they seemed to wait, as if you hadn't quite stepped into their line of sight yet. But you would, very soon. The wind howled that night like an ancient spirit, seeking entry, wrapping its long icy fingers around the towers of Ravenshade Manor, a vast brooding structure tucked at the edge of Weatherham, where trees whispered secrets no one dared repeat, and the fog rolled in with the kind of weight that made even dogs refuse to bark. The soiree had ended, but its echoes lingered, faint piano chords still clinging to the parlor walls, the scent of lavender and wood smoke steeping the air like a ghost refusing to leave. Guests had filtered out hours ago, their laughter now a memory drowned in the silence that followed. Inside, however, the manor was not at rest. Miss Eloan Crane, who had reluctantly accepted Lady Beresford's invitation, had watched the night unfold from corners, never the center, and certainly never unaware. She had seen too many peculiarities. How Lady Beresford seemed to flinch when near the new portrait in the West Wing, how the butler's hand trembled while pouring cognac for the art curator, and how the footman kept avoiding the third-floor stairwell, as though something unseen waited at the top. And then there was the painting, unveiled with dramatic flair, but leaving in its wake a suffocating stillness. The woman depicted wasn't beautiful, but her presence overwhelmed. Her painted eyes pierced through the veil of canvas, with a knowing that made Eloan's skin crawl, as if she had stepped into a room and interrupted a conversation that had never meant to be heard. After the guests had gone, Eloan lingered, moving through halls she knew better than she let on. She had, after all, once been a child within these very walls, long before the Beresfords returned from their travels, and laid claim to what had been long forgotten. She returned to her guest room in the east corridor, with a mind too busy to rest, where the fire in her hearth hissed like it didn't want to burn, and the shadows bent in ways that didn't align with the moon. It was nearly 2 when it came. The scream, not the kind birthed in dreams, but the raw, sharp cry of someone who had seen too much too fast. Eloan was upright before her breath even caught up with her thoughts. She grabbed the heavy brass candle holder, its wax long cooled, and stepped barefoot into the hallway, where silence had resumed its reign. But it was no ordinary silence. It had depth like a breath being held by the entire house. Across the hall Mr. Bramley, the gardener's grandson, peeked out, eyes wide, face pale. Down the corridor, a door creaked. Lady Beresford's. No, the one beside it. The library perhaps. Eloan's candle flame shivered violently though no wind stirred. Then a second sound. Not a scream this time, but a shuffle, low and dragging, as though someone or something was being pulled. Her eyes locked on the corridor to the west wing, where the portrait hung. The sconces flickered. A shadow passed, but no one moved. No one visible, at least. And in that suspended second, she felt it, a watching, a presence heavier than air. Not fear, not yet, but the kind of anticipation that only ever comes before truth tears its way to the surface. The east wing corridors of Ashridge Manor lay cloaked in an unnatural hush, heavy with a silence so thick it felt alive, pulsing faintly with the weight of something unspoken, something watching. Evelyn Thorne had not meant to follow the scream. She had only meant to listen, to judge whether it was nightmare or truth. But her instincts, honed by years of quietly observing human frailty, tugged her forward before thought could intervene. The gallery door was ajar, and inside, bathed in an eerie grey-blue glow cast by moonlight, and the dim flicker of dying sconces, lay Lady Halewell, crumpled at the foot of the enormous haunting portrait that now dominated the room like a dark sun. Her nightdress was soaked with sweat, her skin ghost-pale, one arm stretched toward the painted woman above, as if trying to push something away, or pull something into view. At her side knelt Mira, the chambermaid, trembling and breathless, muttering prayers beneath her breath, as Dr. Harland burst in, his satchel flung open with clinical urgency, hands already at Lady Halewell's wrist. "She's alive," he announced with grim reassurance. "But not whole. Her mind's run somewhere darker." Evelyn stepped in as Mira fled for blankets and water, her gaze lifting slowly to the portrait. There was something in those eyes, sharp, alive, almost imperceptibly shifting. "It moved," came Lady Halewell's rasp, eyes flicking open just long enough to find Evelyn's face. "It looked at me. Not past me. At me." Evelyn, kneeling close, took her icy hand in hers, and in that moment, caught the painting's stare again, saw the weight of knowing in its gaze, not merely paint, but memory trapped in oil. "You came in alone," she whispered. "I had to," the woman gasped. "I felt followed. I had to be sure." The doctor interrupted with a look that ended the conversation, and together they helped her rise, but not before Lady Halewell gripped Evelyn's wrist with surprising strength. "She knows something," she whispered fiercely, eyes wild. "That woman she knows." Later, as the manor settled into a forced quiet, Evelyn returned to the gallery alone, footsteps muffled by the ancient carpets as she approached the painting again. She studied every brushstroke, every nuance of the woman's expression, until her eyes landed on something strange near the foot of the frame. A smudge, dark and slick, like a print made from an oiled glove or boot heel. She dabbed it carefully with a handkerchief, folding it, as if it were a clue left by the painting itself. A soft rustle behind her broke the silence. Edward Mallory stood in the doorway, shirt half tucked, a sheen of sweat on his brow. "What happened?" he asked, but his voice lacked urgency, almost rehearsed. Evelyn told him briefly, noting the way his gaze darted to the portrait, lingered for half a heartbeat too long, then shifted away like it burned. "She said it moved," Evelyn added pointedly. "Strange," Edward muttered. "Some things were never meant to hang in light." Then, with a shrug too casual, he turned and walked away, the sound of his retreating footsteps swallowed by the velvet dark. Evelyn stayed, eyes locked with the portrait once more, and though logic whispered that paint could not watch, her bones told another story, that something unseen had stood in the gallery that night, something not bound by canvas or frame, and the painted woman was not the only one who had seen it. The storm had lingered like an unwanted guest, draping the moors in a curtain of grey and veiling Hawthorne Grange in a hush that felt more deliberate than coincidental. Rain traced lazy trails down the tall arched windows, distorting the view beyond into a watercolor blur, while within the estate, an eerie calm had replaced the usual bustle of domestic life. Even the fireplaces crackled less confidently, as though hesitant to disrupt the silence. In the library, Eleanor Hargrove sat alone, her tea untouched, its steam curling upward like the lingering breath of something unseen. Her thoughts were snagged on the events of the prior night, on what Edith Langley had whispered before she collapsed at the foot of that cursed painting in the drawing room. "It sees," Edith had rasped, eyes wide with a horror that hadn't come from sleep. Eleanor had spent her life navigating truths that lived between words, and what had passed last night was not born of madness. It had the shape of something real, something waiting. She stood abruptly, as the grandfather clock chimed 6:30, the sound echoing like a warning. At that moment, the door creaked and young Clara entered, breathless and pale, her apron stained with something dark and slick. "Miss Eleanor, it's Miss Langley." "She's burning with fever speaking to someone who isn't there," Clara stammered. Without a word, Eleanor followed her, heart thudding not from fear, but from a sense of inevitability. Upstairs, Edith lay twisted in her sheets, whispering frantically toward the far corner of the room where nothing but shadow stood. Behind her, she kept repeating, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. "She doesn't stay in the frame." The physician at her side shook his head, baffled. Eleanor turned on her heel and made her way toward the drawing room. The hallway stretched longer than usual, as though resisting her passage. When she arrived, the room was dim and damp with silence. The painting loomed on the wall, unchanged at first glance. Its subject, a woman in a pale green dress, eyes half-lidded, smile unreadable. But Eleanor drew closer. Her eyes adjusted. There, just beneath the heavy frame, was a ripple in the wallpaper, subtle but deliberate. A corner had been reaffixed, glued or tacked in haste. With a candle in hand, she leaned in. A breath of colder air leaked from behind the painting. She carefully lifted the edge, and found a narrow opening carved into the wall, black as pitch, with something glinting faintly within. A button, a hinge, no, an eye, human, blinking. Eleanor stumbled back, heart hammering, but she didn't scream. Not yet. Someone had been behind the painting, watching, listening, and whatever Edith had seen wasn't born of hallucination. It was a warning no one had taken seriously, not until now. Miss Marple, ever observant, didn't linger on the unsettling painting itself, but instead focused on the wall that framed it. Something about the edges seemed off, slightly askew, like a well-worn suit whose seams had begun to pull apart. The left side of the frame didn't quite align with the molding of the wall, creating an imperceptible gap that, under the flickering candlelight, might have been easy to overlook. Her fingers grazed the surface of the wall, searching with the meticulousness of someone who had spent a lifetime noticing the small things others would miss. And there it was, a faint but unmistakable line, almost invisible unless you knew to look. It wasn't a crack but a seam, a hidden panel barely discernible to the eye. She pressed against it, first gently, then with more determination, and the panel gave way with a soft, almost reluctant click, revealing a narrow dark cavity behind the wall. It was deep and silent, and the smell of stale oil and tobacco filled her nose as she peered into its emptiness. Whoever had hidden behind that painting could have seen everything, watched the very heartbeat of the room without being noticed. But the question swirled with increasing urgency. Who had the means and the motives? Why had they chosen that particular spot, that forgotten corner of the room? Before she could delve deeper, the sound of muffled voices drifted in from the corridor. "It's too dangerous now," one voice said, low and anxious. "We should have left already." "And what? Be caught?" "No, it's too late for that," came the reply, thick with fear. Miss Marple stepped back, restoring the panel to its former place, with the care of someone who knew the weight of secrets. She was about to leave when Marcus appeared, his face drawn with concern. "Miss Marple, I need you," he said urgently. "It's Cynthia. She's gone." Her eyes, sharp as ever, narrowed. "Gone?" she asked, her voice steady, though her mind was already racing through possibilities. "Yes, she left a note, said she needed air, but no one saw her leave, and the grounds are drenched," he explained, holding out the note. Miss Marple took it from him without a word, her gaze flicking to the scrawl on the paper. "I need to be alone. Don't worry, I'll return before lunch." The handwriting was unmistakably Cynthia's, quick, hasty, as though written in a fit of restless urgency. Without looking up, Miss Marple turned back toward the gallery. The painting still stood there, silent and unmoving, but the house had begun to whisper. Stepping outside, the air had softened into a misty haze, the scent of damp earth and crushed flowers thick in the morning stillness. As she moved toward the garden path, the ground beneath her feet was wet, and a faint trail of muddy footprints led from the house. Not along the stone path, but veering into the wet grass, toward the hedge maze. "She didn't take her coat or umbrella," Marcus muttered from behind her, a worried edge to his voice. "And her boots are still inside." Miss Marple didn't reply. She bent down, inspecting the prints. Narrow, light steps, definitely female, and they led in a direction that made no sense. Why would a young woman terrified of a painting wander through a drenched hedge maze? She murmured, more to herself than to Marcus. He was silent for a moment before speaking again, his voice hesitant. Maybe she was just overwhelmed by everything. The painting, Lady Lavinia's episode, the screaming. It's a lot for anyone to take. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her expression unreadable. Yet she stayed long after the music faded. She didn't just leave, she went back, not once, but twice, to the painting. "That tells me something." Marcus stiffened, but said nothing. Miss Marple turned toward the maze, a twist of hedges and narrow, winding paths that had been designed centuries ago by a peculiar viscount with a penchant for the occult. Local legends had long whispered about its strange allure, a place where the very air seemed to hold secrets of its own. And now, it was drawing Cynthia into its depths. Miss Marple stepped carefully into the garden path, the wet leaves underfoot, releasing a faint, earthy scent as she moved deeper into the maze. The air was damp, heavy with the rain that had softened into a gentle mist, and each step she took seemed to pull her further away from the familiar world of Glenwood Hall. The house, with all its secrets and whispers, had long since vanished behind the high hedges, and the sounds of the rain became little more than a distant murmur. Occasionally, a bird flitted by, its wings beating against the silence like a brief erratic pulse, but otherwise, the garden was still eerily still. As Miss Marple turned the next bend, her eyes caught something red, a flash of color against the dark green of the hedge. She reached out and pulled a silk scarf from the bramble, its fabric smooth yet cold in her hand. It was Cynthia's, a scarf she had worn the night before, its bright hue stark against her pale complexion as she adjusted it nervously during the unveiling. Miss Marple paused, her brows furrowing in thought. Why would Cynthia have left it here? She glanced down the path, the footprints resuming, though now they were harder to trace, softened by the mist. She followed them, each step taking her further into the twisting maze. The path led her around a sharp corner, but then, unexpectedly, it stopped. The earth ahead was untouched, the hedge so thick and solid it seemed as if the maze itself had consumed the trail. No broken branches, no sign of anyone pushing through. It was as though Cynthia had vanished into thin air. She crouched, running her fingers over the disturbed soil. The shape of it was wrong, uneven, as though something heavy had been dragged here, and then suddenly lifted. Her eyes darted to the side, and there, nearly hidden by the thick growth, she spotted a wooden ladder, old and worn, leaning against the hedge. It was nearly invisible, unless one knew to look. Miss Marple stood slowly, her gaze flicking to the other side of the hedge, where a small gate was barely visible, locked from the inside. She straightened just as she heard footsteps behind her. Elsie, her face pale and strained, appeared, breathless with news. "Lady Lavinia's asking for you," Elsie said, voice trembling. "She remembers something about the painting." Miss Marple nodded, tucking the scarf into her pocket, her mind already racing. Someone had used that hidden gate, and someone knew Cynthia had been in the garden. She followed Elsie back toward the hall, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the mist that still clung to the garden. Inside, Lady Lavinia's room was dim, the curtains drawn, the air thick with the scent of sickness and fear. She was propped up against the pillows, her face pale, but her eyes sharp and alert. Miss Marple sat beside her, her silence urging the woman to speak. Lady Lavinia turned slowly, her gaze fixed on the ceiling before she spoke in a quiet, shaky voice. It was in her hair, the woman in the painting. The first night before the unveiling, I saw something glinting. I didn't know what it was, but it caught my eye. Miss Marple leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What was it?" she asked softly. "A pin," Lavinia whispered, her fingers trembling. "A gold pin with a red stone." Her eyes flickered, haunted by the memory. "I know that pin. My husband gave one just like it to another woman, years ago. She was an artist, clever, young. They had an affair. I found out about it, but she disappeared before it became a scandal. I never saw her again." Miss Marple's mind churned as the pieces began to fall into place, the name of the woman rising like a shadow from the depths of her memory. "Do you remember her name?" she asked, her voice gentle. Lady Lavinia hesitated, her gaze distant. "Elise Brand," she said softly, as if the name itself weighed heavily on her tongue. The name sent a ripple through Miss Marple's thoughts, an old whisper of village gossip, a scandal that had died too quickly, too mysteriously. "She painted portraits," Lady Lavinia continued, her voice growing fainter, but I never knew what happened to her. Miss Marple stood slowly, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. You believe she painted the woman in the portrait? She asked. Lady Lavinia's eyes filled with something between fear and guilt, as if the truth was something too terrible to fully confront. Miss Marple stood silently, in the grand west corridor of Glenwood Hall, the scent of old wood and beeswax lingering like a forgotten memory in the air. The manor seemed to exhale a quiet breath, the atmosphere thick with unspoken words, as if the very walls themselves held their secrets close. Outside the storm had passed, but the sky remained heavy, casting a pale watery light that filtered through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes drifting lazily in the stillness. The birds had begun to sing again, unbothered by the unease that had seeped into the estate. Her mind churned with the name Eloise Brent, a name she hadn't heard in nearly 30 years. It had surfaced in hushed whispers, following the brief, scandalous affair between Lady Lavinia's late husband, Gerald Grey, and the young artist. Gerald, with his love for beauty and art, had been a patron of Eloise's work, indulging in wild gallery parties, and a penchant for the kind of beauty that often existed only in fleeting moments, both on canvas and in life. When Eloise had disappeared, the village had chosen silence over scandal, burying the truth beneath a veil of propriety. Lady Lavinia had kept her dignity intact, her cool smile, dismissing the matter with the subtle warning that the past was not to be discussed. But now, after all these years, a portrait had appeared, bearing Eloise's features, unsigned, unexplained, and unsettling. It was a mystery that gnawed at Miss Marple's every thought. She made her way back to the gallery, its door ajar as though awaiting her arrival. And there it was, the portrait still hanging, its subject's gaze as piercing as ever. Miss Marple didn't focus on the face this time, but rather the hair, and there it was, the gold pin, almost hidden amongst the dark waves, a small red stone at its center. Lady Lavinia hadn't imagined it. Miss Marple had seen that pin before, not in the painting, but in the village, worn by someone far younger, Cynthia Marsh. She recalled it clearly now, at the summer fete last year, the red glint of the pin in Cynthia's hair beneath her sun hat. Miss Marple had commented on it then, but Cynthia had brushed it off with a casual remark, claiming it was a family heirloom, her mother's or grandmother's. She couldn't remember. But Miss Marple now wondered, had it been passed down, or was it the same pin? The suspicion grew in her chest, like a tightening knot. Her sharp eyes moved to the guest log on the side desk. Lady Lavinia's meticulous records, stretching back decades. She flipped through the pages, and there it was, Eloise Brent, the painter from Surrey. But after her name, the entries were strangely incomplete. Nothing followed. No mention of departure, just a year marked as present. And then the next year, erased entirely. Miss Marple tucked the log under her arm, her thoughts spinning as she headed straight to the vicarage. Reverend Alan Clement had just finished his morning toast when she arrived, greeting her warmly, but with the nervousness of someone who had grown used to the uncomfortable weight of her visits. "I hope you don't mind me dropping in unannounced, Alan," she said, placing the log down in front of him. "I was wondering if you know anything about Cynthia Marsh's parentage." The vicar adjusted his spectacles, his brow furrowing slightly. "Cynthia? Goodness. I suppose I never gave it much thought. She's my wife's niece, lost her parents when she was very young. Her mother died when Cynthia was just a baby, and her father, well, he vanished before that. It was a bit of a scandal, I believe, though we never pressed for the details." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her voice quiet but insistent. "Do you happen to know her mother's name?" The Reverend scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Let me see. Ah, yes. Her name was Margaret. Margaret Marsh." The words hung in the air like a whisper from the past, and Miss Marple's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with a cold, unnerving precision. Miss Marple sat still, her mind whirling as she pieced together the unsettling truth, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke. "Cynthia's real surname isn't Marsh, Alan. It's Brant. I believe her mother was Eloise Brand. The vicar blinked, clearly startled by the revelation. I'm not sure I follow, he stammered, his eyes widening. Miss Marple's gaze hardened, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. It means Cynthia is the daughter of Eloise, and Eloise was involved with Gerald Grey, Lady Lavinia's husband, which means Cynthia was most likely born out of that affair. The Reverend went pale, the color draining from his face. Good Lord, he muttered, his voice faltering. Are you telling me? Yes, Miss Marple continued, her tone chillingly calm. Gerald arranged for Cynthia to be brought to the village after Eloise died. There was no funeral, only a donation and a cryptic envelope of instructions. It seemed strange then, but no one questioned it, not with Lady Lavinia in mourning for her husband's sudden death. The vicar's hands trembled as the pieces began to fall into place. Miss Marple leaned in, her eyes sharp as ever. The timeline is too perfect to be innocent. Eloise vanished. Lady Lavinia's husband died. A child appeared at the vicarage, with nothing but a jeweled pin and a painter's surname. Silence hung heavy in the air as Miss Marple left the vicarage, her mind racing as she returned to Glenwood Hall. As she stepped inside, she found Marcus speaking with Elsie in hushed tones. Any sign of her? He asked when he saw her, his expression tight with worry. Not yet, Miss Marple replied, her voice steady, though the weight of the mystery hung over her like a storm cloud. But I have a feeling she'll return before supper. Marcus sighed, his voice grim. I hope so. Lavinia keeps asking about the portrait, insisting someone's been in the house. Miss Marple's eyes darkened. She's not wrong, she said quietly, her gaze far away. Marcus frowned, confusion and concern flickering across his face. What do you mean? But Miss Marple didn't answer. Instead she made her way up the staircase, her footsteps measured, and entered Lady Lavinia's room. The older woman lay still, her eyes open but dull, hands folded across her stomach as if in resignation. Lavinia, Miss Marple said softly, her voice gentle but piercing. I believe the woman in that portrait is Eloise Brand. Lady Lavinia didn't respond immediately, but her fingers twitched, curling ever so slightly. I thought she was dead, Lavinia murmured, her voice barely audible. She may be, Miss Marple replied, her gaze unwavering, but her daughter isn't. Lavinia's eyes grew wide, disbelief and fear flooding her features. Her daughter, Cynthia? She whispered, her mind racing to places it had long since buried. Miss Marple nodded. Do you recognize her? Lavinia's lips trembled as memories long dormant began to surface. He always swore it ended before she got pregnant. I didn't believe him then, and I certainly don't now. Miss Marple sat beside her, her expression solemn. Lavinia, did you bring the painting into this house because you recognized her? Tears filled Lavinia's eyes, though not a single one fell. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking as she spoke. I told myself it was a coincidence. I bought it anonymously from a private gallery, so no one would question it. But the moment I saw her face, I knew it was Eloise, or someone meant to look like her. Miss Marple's expression softened, but her words carried a weight that seemed to press down on the very air around them. And you think Cynthia painted it? Lavinia's breath caught in her throat, but she couldn't speak. Miss Marple didn't need an answer. It arrived 2 weeks after Cynthia came back from London. Lavinia whispered, her voice almost hollow. I don't know, but it felt like a message. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and Miss Marple felt a chill crawl down her spine. The portrait was more than just a likeness. It was a key, and Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the lock was about to turn. As she made her way back to the gallery, the afternoon sunlight had shifted, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor in golden pools. The portrait still hung in place, serene yet somehow pulsing with an energy that Miss Marple couldn't quite explain. The woman in the painting seemed to gaze not outward, but inward, towards something unseen, something beyond the frame, beyond the room itself. It was as though she was waiting for someone, or something, to discover her secrets. And Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that those secrets were not finished being uncovered. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the gallery once more, her gaze lingering on the paintings that adorned the walls, the pastoral scenes and the youthful portrait of a boy. Nothing remarkable, nothing that stirred the soul. Yet something niggled at the edges of her mind. She had seen the details before, the hushed whispers of forgotten stories hidden in the strokes of oil and canvas. Her fingers brushed against the catalogue notes she had earlier discovered in Lady Lavinia's sitting room. The late Lord Grey's meticulous record-keeping was precise, every frame numbered, each acquisition logged with a quiet care that bordered on obsession. Yet one piece stood out. She flicked through the pages until she found it. The wall of portraits, numbered and logged with precision. But as she glanced over it, she realized something was missing. She counted again. Once, twice, 10. One was gone. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she approached the wall again, her fingers tracing the edges of the void, the faint rectangular outline where a frame had once hung. A layer of dust had not settled there. The paper beneath had a different hue, as though the frame had been removed with great care. "Elsie," Miss Marple called softly, her voice cutting through the silence. The maid appeared in an instant, her apron askew, her face ashen, eyes wide with the unease of someone caught in a web of secrets. "A portrait was removed from here recently?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone steady, though her mind raced. Elsie's hesitation was palpable, her hands fidgeting nervously with her apron. "I wasn't told to move anything, Miss Marple," she stammered, her eyes darting around the room as though the very walls were listening. "But, a few days ago, just after dawn, I saw Miss Cynthia in here. She was staring at the wall, and when she left, there was a space. She said Lady Lavinia wanted it cleaned. Do you know where it went?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice low but insistent. Elsie shifted uneasily, then whispered, "I think she took it herself, to the old garden shed. She used to sketch there. I've seen her go more than once." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts churning. The garden shed stood in a forgotten corner of the estate, on the edge of the overgrown orchard. Time had not been kind to it. Once a greenhouse, it had now become a lean-to of rusting tools and ivy-clad neglect. Few ventured there, and that made it the perfect hiding place for secrets. Miss Marple moved across the damp ground, her boots sinking into the soft earth with each step. The door of the shed groaned in protest as she opened it, the musty scent of damp wood and turpentine hitting her with the weight of years gone by. There in the dim light at the back, hidden behind old plant pots and rotting chairs, leaned the canvas, not framed, not hung, but discarded like an unwanted memory. With careful hands Miss Marple pulled the painting free, her breath catching in her throat as she examined it. It was unmistakably Cynthia, captured in the same painterly style, the same color palette. Her hair pinned up, a red jewel glinting in the light, yet the expression was unlike anything Miss Marple had seen before. Gone was the shy, nervous girl. Instead there was a fierce pride in the set of her jaw, the defiance in the arch of her brow. Cynthia had painted herself, but not as she was. This was the woman she wanted to be, the woman she dreamed of becoming. And yet the background of the painting told a chilling tale, a faint, ghostly outline of the woman from the first portrait, the one believed to be Eloise. It was as though Cynthia had been haunted by her mother's image, her face lingering like a shadow in the background, watching her, judging her. Miss Marple studied the canvas closely, noting the technique, unmistakable, the same as the first portrait. Cynthia had painted them both, and the revelation hit Miss Marple like a thunderclap. Cynthia knew the truth. She had uncovered her mother's identity, and Lady Lavinia had kept it from her. The missing piece of the puzzle was now in place, and Miss Marple had a sinking feeling that this discovery would only be the beginning of an even darker revelation. The painting wasn't merely a message, it was a challenge. With careful hands, Miss Marple replaced it where she had found it, her mind racing, the weight of the discovery still heavy on her chest. She wiped her hands on her shawl, the cool air of the shed pressing in from every corner. As she stepped back toward the path, she froze. Fresh footprints marred the mud, larger than her own, the deep impression of men's boots sinking into the earth. They hadn't been there long, and they were leading away from the shed, toward the woods. Someone had been here before her, and judging by the direction they'd taken, they hadn't been in a hurry to leave. The realization sent a chill down her spine. At Glenwood Hall, Marcus Fielding stood before the roaring fire, his hands outstretched to the warmth, but the coldness in his eyes couldn't be chased away. "She's still missing," he said, his voice low, and his words heavy with the burden of unspoken truths. "If she doesn't show up soon, we'll have to call the police." Miss Marple entered the room, her presence calm yet unsettling. She removed her gloves with deliberate slowness, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "I wouldn't be so quick to involve the authorities," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Cynthia isn't lost. She's angry. There's a difference." Both men turned sharply to her, the weight of her words making their insides tighten. "Have you seen her?" Marcus asked, his tone sharp with concern. "No," Miss Marple replied, her voice even. "But I've seen what she left behind." Dr. Quinton's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You mean the scarf?" Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint, knowing smile. "No, I mean her second painting." She turned to Marcus then, her words calculated and quiet. "You knew, didn't you? About Eloise, about Cynthia's parentage." Marcus hesitated, guilt flickering in his eyes before he spoke. "It wasn't my place to say," he murmured. "But it was hers," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "And now, like her mother, Cynthia has vanished. Only unlike Eloise, she intends to return." Dr. Quinton frowned, the confusion clear on his face. "Why would she disappear at all?" Miss Marple's voice was low, as though speaking more to herself than to them. "Because she doesn't know who to trust. Not the woman who raised her, not the man who concealed the truth, and certainly not the house that brought her mother's ghost back to life." The fire crackled on, but its warmth could not touch the chill that had settled deep within the walls of Glenwood Hall. As Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her shawl pulled tight over her shoulders, she watched Marcus Fielding from the corner of her eye. He stood at the window, his arms crossed, staring out into the blackened gardens, willing Cynthia to emerge from the mist, a child lost in the dark. "She's only a child," he muttered, his voice soft, tinged with worry. "She's 19. Miss Marple corrected him, her tone measured. "Not quite a child anymore." He turned sharply, his gaze piercing. "You think she's in danger?" Miss Marple shook her head, the quiet certainty in her voice as sharp as the night air outside. "No. I think she's the danger. Or at least that's what someone else believes." His frown deepened. "You're suggesting someone is afraid of her?" "Terrified," Miss Marple replied simply. "You see, Mr. Fielding, when the past is buried, it stays quiet until someone digs it up." The sound of crystal clinking in his glass was the only noise in the room as he exhaled sharply and moved to pour himself a drink. He sank into the armchair opposite her, his eyes hard, the weight of Miss Marple's words settling over him like a heavy fog. "She found out, didn't she?" he asked, his voice strained. "Yes," Miss Marple answered. "She discovered who her mother was. Perhaps by accident. Perhaps she always suspected. But the second painting in the gallery wasn't the beginning. It was the end of something." Marcus nodded slowly. "You saw it? The second painting?" "I did," Miss Marple replied. "And I know she painted both. She painted them herself." Marcus stared at her, then looked away, drink in hand. "You're not going to tell Lady Lavinia, are you?" he asked finally. Miss Marple's gaze hardened. "I suspect she already knows. She's known more than she's ever admitted. But she's frightened. Not of Cynthia, but of guilt. Guilt has a way of distorting how people see things, particularly portraits." Marcus's face fell, and the truth hung in the air between them, thick and undeniable. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of his secrets settling in his chest like an anchor. "She asked me to destroy the second painting," he confessed softly, the words falling from him like stones into a deep well. The painting had always been more than just a reflection of the past. It was a silent accusation, one that had lingered like a shadow over the estate. When Cynthia had unveiled it days before the party, the reaction had been swift and damning. Lavinia's face had drained of color, her breath shallow, as though the very air had been sucked from the room. She'd insisted Marcus promised to burn it, to rid the house of its unsettling presence. Yet Marcus, standing near the window, watched the storm clouds roll in over the distant hills, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass, as if the weight of those memories had never left. I couldn't do it, he confessed quietly, his voice a low murmur against the crackling fire. It felt wrong. The painting. It was too much, too raw. Cynthia poured herself into it. Too much fury, too much truth. I thought if I hid it long enough, the emotions would fade. But now, his words trailed off into the heavy silence that hung between them. Miss Marple's gaze never left him, sharp and knowing. Why protect her? She asked, her voice calm, measured. He met her eyes without hesitation, his answer a quiet testament to the tangled web of relationships that bound them all together. She's family, he said, though the words hung uncomfortably in the air. Not by blood perhaps, but I've spent my life managing Lavenia's affairs, cleaning up the messes she refuses to acknowledge. A pause followed, the tension in the room thickening. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her voice lowering as she posed a question that had been haunting the edges of the mystery. Do you believe Eloise Brandt died naturally? Marcus froze, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to place the weight of the question into the framework of everything he had been told. I was told she fell ill. A fever. Gerald. He said it was natural. Miss Marple's lips pressed together, her gaze unyielding. And you believed him? She asked. Marcus drained his glass in one swift motion, the crystal clinking softly in the stillness. No, he muttered. I didn't think so. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but only for a moment. I didn't either, she said quietly. Someone silenced her, and someone is still terrified of the consequences. The words hung in the air like a threat. Eloise had a child, Miss Marple continued. A child, Gerald, hid in plain sight. And now that child knows the truth. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on his shoulders. So what now? He asked, his voice hoarse. Miss Marple rose slowly from her seat, the candlelight flickering in her hand, casting long shadows across the room. Now, she said, her voice low and deliberate, I find the person who lied to the dead. She left him standing there, his thoughts a swirl of confusion and dread, as she ascended the stairs, her steps light as a whisper. At the top of the stairs, she paused before the door to Lavenia's room, the faintest glow of light spilling from the crack beneath it. Miss Marple entered without knocking, the door creaking softly as it swung open. Lavenia was awake, sitting upright in the bed, her gaze distant as she stared out the window, as if seeking something beyond the night. You were listening, Miss Marple said gently, her voice not a question, but a quiet acknowledgement. Lavenia turned to her slowly, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were sharp, filled with an unspoken truth. She looks so much like her, Lavenia whispered, her voice trembling. It's uncanny. You recognized the resemblance long before the painting? Miss Marple asked. Yes, Lavenia replied, her voice barely audible. I knew long before she ever saw it. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Her next question, a quiet probe into the heart of the mystery. Why bring the portrait into the house? Lavenia closed her eyes, the weight of the past pressing on her. I don't know, she whispered. Perhaps to punish myself, or maybe I thought it was penance. But when Cynthia looked at it, really looked at it, I saw something break inside her, and I knew she had figured it out. Miss Marple sat beside the bed, her presence a steadying force as Lavenia's voice cracked with the truth she had long buried. Did she confront you? Miss Marple asked. Lavenia nodded, her face tightening. She asked if the woman in the portrait was her mother, and I didn't answer. I couldn't. Her eyes grew hard as she spoke the next words. She asked if I killed her. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered, her voice calm as she asked, and did you? Lavenia's lips twisted into a strangled laugh, but her eyes were filled with sorrow. No, she said quietly. But I wanted to. Back then, when I found out about Gerald and Eloise, they humiliated me. I was the lady of the house, and they made me feel invisible, replaceable. Miss Marple sat still, her mind turning over the fragments of the story, the tangled emotions that had led to this moment. Did Gerald kill her? she asked softly. Lavinia looked away, her voice barely a whisper. I think he was going to leave me. Take Eloise to London. Start over. I was ill at the time, bedridden. And then Eloise vanished. And Gerald died. They said it was a heart condition. But I've always wondered if someone else intervened. Miss Marple's voice was barely audible as she leaned closer. Who would that be, Lavinia? The silence stretched. But Lavinia's lips moved soundlessly before Miss Marple reached out, taking her hand gently. You don't need to say it aloud, she said softly. But you must help me find the truth. Cynthia's fingers tightened around Lavinia's, her voice barely above a whisper, a tremor of unease in every word. I think she went to find Eloise, she said, her gaze distant, as if the very thought of it pulled her into a darker place. Miss Marple's brow furrowed deeply. But Eloise is dead, she replied with a calmness that betrayed none of the dread that was slowly creeping up her spine. Lavinia, however, shook her head slowly, her expression haunted, her eyes wide with fear, and something far more unsettling, regret. She doesn't believe that, she murmured, her voice faltering as though the mere idea terrified her. She told me before she left that she could hear her at night through the walls. The chill in the room deepened at the sound of those words, and Miss Marple felt her heartbeat quicken, a knot tightening in her stomach. That explained the hidden panel, the whispers in the night, the strange sensation of being watched even when no one was there. Cynthia hadn't just uncovered a long-buried truth. She had pursued it, followed it into the very heart of the house, into its dark, unseen corners, where shadows thrived and secrets festered. The air in the room felt heavier now, thick with the weight of what had been revealed, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath as if it too were waiting for something. The night had only just begun to unravel its mystery. Glenwood Hall had always been a place that carried the ghosts of the past. Its very foundation seemed soaked in the echoes of those who had walked its halls long ago. But some secrets, Miss Marple knew, were too dark to be contained by time or the structure of the house. Some rooms, hidden away from the blueprints, were never meant to be found. And yet here she was again, standing in the gallery of the grand house, her focus not on the portrait this time, but on the wall behind it. The wall that had always seemed ordinary, part of the room blending seamlessly into its surroundings. But Miss Marple had learned to trust her instincts, and something in the wall had called to her. The shadows shifted as she moved, and with the flickering candle held gently in her hand, she pressed her gloved fingers against the panel, seeking the faintest sign of what she had suspected. The house was still. The faintest creak echoed in the silence as her fingers found the hidden mechanism. A breath of cold, stale air rushed to greet her, as the panel slowly yielded, groaning open as if it hadn't seen light in decades. Inside was not just a crawl space as she had expected, but a narrow, winding corridor no more than 2 feet wide. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, and the mustiness of years of neglect. Cobwebs clung to the walls and brushed against her shoulders as she stepped inside, her candlelight casting eerie, flickering shadows that seemed to twist and dance along the ancient walls. She moved forward cautiously, each step deliberate, as if afraid that even the smallest sound would stir something hidden deep within the darkness of this forgotten part of the house. Then at the end of the corridor, she saw it, a door old and weathered, its iron hinges rusted and barely holding it in place. She gently pushed it open, the door creaking loudly as though it had been waiting for this very moment. What lay beyond was a small windowless room, its stone walls thick and oppressive. The only light in the room came from the candle Miss Marple held, its faint glow barely reaching the far corners. The air inside was heavy, as though it hadn't moved in years. The room felt trapped in time, as though nothing had changed since the day it had been sealed off. And yet, it was not empty. In the center of the room stood a rickety wooden chair, its legs uneven, as though it had been placed there long ago, waiting for someone to return to it. A small dusty wineglass sat forgotten on a narrow table beside the chair, and in the corner, a faded blanket lay folded, untouched, as though it had never been disturbed. But it was the far wall that caught her attention. There, leaning face down against the stone, was a painting. Miss Marple crossed the room slowly, her heart quickening as she turned it over. What she saw took her breath away. It wasn't a finished portrait, but more a rough sketch, an unfinished attempt in oils. The face it depicted was not complete, but the features were unmistakable. A woman's wide eyes, delicate cheekbones, the beginning of a familiar expression. It was Cynthia. The sketch was raw, frantic, as though the artist had been obsessed with capturing her, studying her every detail. And it wasn't just this portrait. As Miss Marple scanned the room, she saw more sketches, pinned to the walls with rusting tacks. There were charcoal drawings, Cynthia at tea, standing in the garden, even one of her sleeping in a chair. Each one was drawn from memory, or more disturbingly, from behind some hidden vantage point, as though the artist had been watching her from a secret place, capturing her life in secret. Miss Marple's breath hitched in her chest. Whoever had lived, or more accurately, existed in this room, had been consumed by their obsession, their need to capture Cynthia in every moment, every angle, as if she were some muse or prisoner, frozen in time for their private collection. She turned slowly, candlelight trembling in her hand, the weight of what she had discovered pressing down on her chest. The room had become a shrine, a place where Cynthia was worshipped, but not just her, Eloise too. The two women, past and present, had been blurred together in the mind of someone who had been too enamored with them both, too fixated on their beauty, their lives. The boundary between the two seemed to dissolve, like a maddening illusion that had driven the artist to the edge of madness. Miss Marple moved toward the floor, where a journal lay half buried in dust. She picked it up carefully, the cracked leather cover rough beneath her fingers. The pages inside were curled with moisture, the ink smeared in places as if it had been written in haste. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, almost as if the writer had been on the verge of losing their mind. The words inside were chilling. "She's like her, too much like her." Miss Marple felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. This was no mere coincidence. Whoever had written these words had been consumed by a deep obsession, one that crossed the line between admiration and madness. The room had not just been a hiding place, it had been a monument to these women, a dark, twisted altar, where memories and secrets were kept, not for reverence, but for a much darker, far more dangerous purpose. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, as though the walls themselves were watching her, urging her to uncover the truth, to follow the twisted threads of this mystery to its very end, no matter how dark or dangerous the path might be. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she closed the journal, her eyes lingering on the cryptic words, the eyes in the wall. The phrase echoed in her mind like a slow drumbeat, growing louder with every passing second. The weight of the discovery pressed down on her chest, and the cold air in the room seemed to thicken, crawling across her skin. She had to leave. She had to leave before the walls themselves closed in on her. Quietly, she retraced her steps through the narrow, hidden passage, the faint glow of her candle flickering like a dying ember in the suffocating silence. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet seemed to mock her urgency, but it wasn't fear that pushed her forward. It was the pull of an unraveling mystery, one that was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The hidden room, that forgotten corner of Glenwood Hall, wasn't just a relic of the past. It had been alive in a sense, breathing through its dark secrets, watching. And someone had been watching Cynthia, perhaps even Eloise before her. The thought made her blood run cold, but she had no time to dwell on it now. The pieces were falling into place faster than she could manage, but they were all leading to one terrifying truth. She hurried to the study, where Lady Lavinia had kept her husband's journals, his architectural notes, a glimpse into the mind of the man who had designed Glenwood Hall. The old blueprint lay there, yellowed with age, its edges curling like brittle paper. There, penciled into the margins, was a cryptic note in Gerald Gay's unmistakable handwriting. Servant's bolt room sealed 19. The words rattled through her mind like the echo of a distant bell tolling. Bolt room, she repeated silently. Hidden chamber. It had been concealed, sealed off for more than a century. And yet someone had found it, had reopened it. The house had kept its secrets for so long. But now they were being dragged into the light. Before she could contemplate further, the sound of voices reached her ears. It was Dr. Quinton, speaking in hushed tones, his voice low and urgent. "You told her too much," he muttered. Marcus's voice followed, equally strained. "I had to. She already suspected. If she's missing, the police will dig, and they'll find the room." "She won't go to the police," Quinton hissed, his tone sharp with frustration. "Not yet. But she's too smart for her own good." And then, as if he hadn't meant to say it, the name slipped out. So was her mother. A cold shiver ran through Miss Marple, but she forced herself to stay still, her heart hammering in her chest. Dr. Quinton's calm demeanor, his precise measured words, suddenly felt like a mask. He had been present through every unsettling event, Lavania's breakdown, Gerald's sudden death, and now Cynthia's disappearance. The pieces of this twisted puzzle were starting to fit together, and the realization was darker than anything she had feared. She waited, holding her breath, until the men's footsteps faded down the hall. The tension in the air still lingered, as Miss Marple stepped cautiously into the hallway, her mind already racing ahead. She moved quickly, deliberately, toward the telephone in the vestibule. With trembling hands, she dialed the vicarage. "Alan," she said, when he answered, her voice steady but urgent. "I need you to come at once. Bring the constable, but don't tell anyone you're coming." "What is it, Jane?" Alan's voice was laced with concern. "I've found something," she replied quietly. "And someone is going to great lengths to keep it hidden." Within 20 minutes, Constable Yarrow arrived, drenched from the rain, but sharp-eyed, followed closely by Reverend Alan Clement, his cheeks flushed, not from the cold, but from the urgency in Miss Marple's voice. They met her in the drawing room, where the fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth fighting the chill of the discovery Miss Marple had made. "I'm sorry to trouble you both," she began, folding her hands in front of her, as if nothing in the world could shake her composure. "But I believe we are no longer in the realm of mere speculation. This is not a simple disappearance. This is something far darker." Constable Yarrow's brow furrowed, his nervousness barely contained. "Have you found her?" he asked. "I know where she might be," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes flicking toward the door, as if she could already see the unknown danger lurking outside. "But we must act delicately. What we're dealing with here is the resurfacing of a crime buried long ago. Perhaps too." She handed the journal to the constable, watching his expression shift as he skimmed the pages. His face grew taut with confusion, then concern, when he came across the repeated phrase, "the eyes in the wall." "What is this place?" he asked, his voice tight with unease. Miss Marple's gaze never left him. "A room hidden in the bones of Glenwood Hall," she replied slowly. "A place sealed for over a century. Someone reopened it. Someone used it. Not for storage, but for watching Cynthia. And before her perhaps, Eloise." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The constable's face went pale, and Reverend Clement's gaze grew distant, as though the weight of what Miss Marple had just revealed was too much to comprehend. Both men, in their own way, understood now. This was not just about a missing woman. It was about something far more sinister, something that had been growing in the shadows of the house for years. The dark past of Glenwood Hall was clawing its way into the present. And no one, not even Miss Marple, knew just how deep the roots of this mystery went. The tension in the room thickened as Miss Marple placed the journal down, her fingers brushing over the creased pages, each line a revelation of secrets buried long ago. The constable, Harold Yarrow, looked uneasy, his eyes scanning the cryptic notes. his brow furrowing deeper with every word he read. "Who kept this journal?" he asked, the urgency in his voice barely masked. Miss Marple's gaze remained unwavering, her voice calm yet heavy with meaning. "That," she said slowly, "is what we must uncover. And I fear the answer is much closer than we'd like to admit." At that moment, a soft sound echoed from the hallway, drawing all eyes to the door. Dr. Quinton entered, his usual composure unchanged, a teacup in hand. "Ah, a meeting in progress," he murmured, his tone as neutral as ever. But Miss Marple was undeterred. "You were at Glenwood Hall the year Eloise Brandt vanished," she said, her words like ice cutting through the silence. The doctor's calm expression remained intact, but his eyes flickered with something unreadable. "I've been the village doctor for decades, Miss Marple. I've seen disappearances come and go. Eloise's case was tragic, but it was hardly the first of its kind." He took a sip of his tea, as though dismissing the gravity of the conversation. "And Gerald Gay's death?" She pressed her gaze fixed on him like a hawk. His hand hesitated for just a fraction of a second before he answered. "Congenital heart failure. It was in his family history." But Miss Marple wasn't done. "I found your handwriting in the Bolt room," she said quietly. There was a noticeable pause then, a subtle change in the doctor's demeanor, just a flicker of tension in his otherwise serene face. "You knew about the room, didn't you?" she continued, her voice soft but unyielding. "You used it, perhaps long before Gerald's death, and I believe you were in love with Eloise." The doctor's expression didn't change, but the faintest tremor ran through his fingers. She pressed on. "When Gerald discovered your obsession, he confronted you, didn't he? And when he threatened to expose you, you silenced him." The teacup in Dr. Quinton's hand shook ever so slightly. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a whisper. "Tell me, doctor, was it poison? Did you slip something into his brandy, knowing you had the perfect opportunity?" His face tightened, a flicker of something darker crossing his features, but he remained silent. "He should have loved me," he murmured at last, his voice barely audible, the weight of regret palpable in the air. The constable, Yarrow, took a cautious step forward, his pen hovering over his notebook. "Tell me, doctor," Miss Marple asked softly, "why follow Cynthia? Why stalk her?" Dr. Quinton's eyes darkened, his voice shaking as he confessed. "She looked just like her. Just like Eloise. It was as if she had come back to haunt me, to torment me with her gaze." Miss Marple nodded, the pieces falling into place. "Where is she now?" she asked. The doctor swallowed hard, his face drained of color. "The folly in the woods," he whispered, almost to himself. "Is a cellar beneath it. She found the Bolt room, confronted me. I locked her in, thinking she'd understand, but she started screaming. I panicked and left her there." Miss Marple's expression softened ever so slightly, but her voice remained firm. "And now she's safe, is she? You left her there, alone because you couldn't stand the thought of losing her too." The doctor's silence was deafening. She turned to the constable. "Go now," she ordered. "Quickly. Find her." Yarrow rushed out, the Reverend following close behind. As the door closed, Miss Marple turned back to Dr. Quinton, her gaze piercing. "You were never invisible, doctor. Just unloved. And there's a difference." His eyes, once filled with cold defiance, now welled up with unshed tears. But he said nothing. Later, when Cynthia was found, cold, frightened but unharmed, she would not speak of what she saw, nor of the strange whispers that seemed to float through the walls of Glenwood Hall. She would take up her brush again, but not to paint ghosts. She would finally paint something real, something that could set her free. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost suffocating, as though the very walls of Glenwood Hall had exhaled after a long, unseen battle. The storm that had raged for so many weeks had finally been quelled, and a pale spring sun now bathed the village, in soft, almost mournful light. casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets of Marliam. Yet inside the grand house, the stillness had taken on a different nature. The strange whispers, the unsettling footsteps in the night, the secrets long buried. None of these things stirred anymore. They had all been unmasked, and what had been left behind was an unsettling calm. Miss Marple, alone in the gallery, stood before the portrait of Eloise Brant, the painting that had begun it all. The woman's gaze, once so haunting, no longer held the weight of accusation. There was nothing sinister in her eyes now, only the quiet presence of a memory that would not fade. Since that night, the night Cynthia had been rescued from the cellar, the girl had not returned to the gallery, her mind still trapped in the horrors of that room. The village whispered, of course, about the mystery that had unfolded, but the whispers now carried a different tone, respectful, subdued. Even the gossipers, it seemed, had learned to speak in hushed tones. Lady Lavinia, once so proud and commanding, had become a shadow of herself, retreating into the confines of her bedroom, her voice scarcely heard, her appetite all but lost. And Dr. Quinton, his fate sealed, had been quietly escorted from the house, not in disgrace, but with the quiet dignity of a man who knew the inevitable consequences of his obsession. He had been charged with unlawful imprisonment, but it was the quiet tragedy of his story, the tale of a man who had been consumed by love, by envy, by madness, that would echo long after his departure. As Miss Marple stood before the portrait, her fingers gently tracing the frame, the memory of Eloise's red jewel in the woman's hair seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Eloise Brant had never returned to Marliam, not in any physical form at least, but her legacy lingered, woven through the fabric of the house, the village, and the very people who had once known her. The truth, twisted and buried for so long, had clawed its way to the surface, even from beyond the grave. Footsteps broke the stillness, soft and deliberate, as Cynthia stepped into the room, her figure framed in the doorway. Her face was pale, but there was a new steadiness in her eyes, a quiet determination. In her hands she held a small canvas, unframed and still damp at the corners. "I finished it," she said, her voice softer than the rustling of leaves in the wind. Miss Marple turned, a knowing smile curving her lips. "May I see?" she asked. Cynthia stepped forward and held out the painting. It was a self-portrait, not the typical vanity of youth, but a true reflection of the woman she had become. Her eyes, deep pools of sorrow and strength, met Miss Marple's. Her mouth, ever so slightly downturned, hinted at the weight of loss, but there was dignity in the lift of her chin, in the way her shoulders were squared. "I used to paint how others saw me," Cynthia murmured, her voice trembling with emotion. "But now I paint how I see." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "That is the beginning of truth." They stood together, the silence between them filled with something unspoken. Finally, Cynthia looked up, her gaze moving to the portrait of Eloise. "What will happen to it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's for you to decide." Miss Marple replied gently. "She was your mother." Cynthia, her hands no longer trembling, walked slowly to the painting of Eloise. For the first time, she stood before it not as a frightened girl, but as a woman who had reclaimed her own identity. "I don't think I'll remove it," she said quietly. "Let it stay, not as a ghost, but as history." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Wise choice." That evening, as the last light of day faded from the windows of Glenwood Hall, the house held one final gathering, a small private affair. Those who remained stood in the shadows, the weight of the past still lingering in the air, but also the faint promise of something more. The storm had passed. The silence was no longer a curse, but a kind of peace. The days that followed the unmasking of Glenwood Hall's hidden truths were marked by an eerie calm, as if the mansion itself had exhaled a long-held breath, shaking off the suffocating tension that had clung to its walls for so long. The village of Marliam, once overshadowed by the shadow of fear, bathed in the soft golden light of an early spring sun, casting long shadows across cobbled streets. Yet inside the halls of Glenwood, there was no immediate peace. The gallery stood untouched, save for the lingering presence of the portraits. Now more than mere likenesses on canvas. They were history, both mourned and celebrated. Miss Marple stood silently before the portrait of Eloise Brant, her sharp eyes tracing the painted lines with a steady gaze. The air in the room had shifted since that fateful night. What once felt like an accusation now felt like a question, a silent plea for acknowledgement. Cynthia, having barely returned to the gallery since her harrowing ordeal, now approached with something new in her grasp, a canvas, still damp with the weight of recent creation. Her hand trembled ever so slightly, but her face bore a new determination. "I finished it," she murmured, her voice a quiet declaration of something reclaimed. The painting was not one of beauty, nor of self-indulgence, but one of raw, unflinching truth. Her eyes, framed by sorrow and resilience, told a story of quiet strength. "I used to paint how others saw me," Cynthia said, almost as if speaking to the very portrait that had once terrified her. "Now I paint how I see myself." Miss Marple nodded, the faintest of smiles tugging at her lips. "That is the beginning of truth," she replied softly, her gaze shifting back to the portrait of Eloise, now standing beside it. A new kind of connection had been forged, one that transcended time and tragedy. Later, as the evening wore on and the guests had all departed, leaving Glenwood Hall shrouded once more in silence, Miss Marple lingered by the fire in the drawing-room. The truth had not been neatly packaged or easily accepted. There had been no public trial, no grand gestures of vindication, only the quiet settling of a deep, unresolved story. The portrait, once a symbol of guilt and mystery, now stood as a testament to the long-buried secrets of the house. It had waited patiently, its silent gaze waiting for someone to finally see it, to understand its truth. And now, at last, it had been seen. But the mysteries of Glenwood were far from over. Days later, as Cynthia dusted the portrait of Eloise, an act of reclamation, a way of confronting her fears, she unwittingly uncovered something more. As the frame shifted in her hands, a soft rustling caught her ear. From behind the gilded edges of the portrait, a yellowed envelope fell to the ground, its wax seal broken with time. The letter inside was unmistakable in its elegance, penned in sweeping masculine handwriting. "Gerald Grays." Cynthia read the words slowly, her heart pounding as she pieced together the hidden layers of a tragic past. "My dearest Eloise," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I have failed you. Lavinia's suspicions grow darker with every passing day. She watches you when you aren't looking, and I fear what she is capable of." The words held an undeniable weight, and as Cynthia read, the truth of Gerald's love for Eloise, and his desperate attempts to protect her, unraveled before her eyes. The affair that had once been whispered about in the village was not one of careless passion, but of real, tragic love, driven by a desire to shield Eloise and their daughter from the cruelty of Glenwood. Cynthia sat motionless, the letter still in her hands, the world around her fading as she processed the revelation. When Miss Marple found her moments later, the letter open in Cynthia's lap, she knew something monumental had shifted. "Did you know about this?" Cynthia asked, her voice small, tremulous. "No," Miss Marple replied, her gaze soft but knowing. "But I suspected your father was not the man the village believed him to be." The truth had not only cleared Gerald's name, but had given Cynthia a glimpse into the kind of love that had shaped her life in ways she hadn't yet understood. She handed Miss Marple the letter, her voice barely a whisper. "It changes everything," she said. "Gerald wanted to protect us. It wasn't just a careless affair. It was love, real and tragic." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes, the only way to clear a family's name is to let the truth speak for itself." But as Cynthia pondered the fate of the letter's existence, she couldn't help but wonder, had Lavinia known of its contents? If she had, why had she hidden it? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her voice soft but deliberate. If Lavinia found this letter, she chose to conceal it rather than destroy it. That tells us something important about her, something she doesn't want to reveal. The mystery deepened, but one thing was clear. The truth was finally being spoken, one layer at a time, And with each revelation, Glenwood Hall was becoming something entirely different. The winds of change seemed to blow with an unsettling force through Glenwood Hall, a house once filled with whispered secrets and the weight of buried truths. Cynthia had spent years in its shadow, her every step heavy with the past, and yet, as she stood at the precipice of revealing everything, the truth seemed as elusive as the mist that clung to the morning air. The storm outside rattled the ancient windows, as if nature itself wished to tear the walls down and expose the hidden sins of those who once dwelled within. Two women, bound by blood but separated by more than just time, one a victim of the past, the other its reluctant heir, stood at the center of it all. When Cynthia uncovered the letter behind her mother's portrait, it was as though the past had reached out with its cold fingers, demanding to be acknowledged. Gerald's words, penned in desperation and filled with sorrow, hinted at a love that had been suffocated by the weight of expectations and possessive love, a love that had tried to protect but only brought about destruction. And yet, as Miss Marple had known all along, the darkest truths were often those that remained unspoken. Lady Lavinia, the woman who had held on to her guilt as though it were the only thing left that was hers to control, now sat in the suffocating silence of her own regrets. The letter had revealed nothing more than a truth Lavinia could never escape. Love was not hers to possess, not in the way she thought, and the consequences of that belief would forever haunt her. As Miss Marple's soft voice cut through the fog of uncertainty, urging Lavinia to make one last attempt at redemption, it became clear that there was only one way for the cycle of silence and shame to end: by telling the truth, not just to others, but to herself. Yet the letter was only the beginning. The arrival of Benedict Shaw, a man who spoke with the crisp accent of London, and whose presence seemed as out of place as the very painting he had come to inquire about, marked the beginning of a new chapter. The photograph he produced from his briefcase, a portrait that Cynthia had once thought was nothing more than a distant memory, set into motion a series of revelations that would tear apart the fragile fabric of the life she had rebuilt. For the Gainsworth Trust, a shadowy organization that dealt in the hidden treasures of the art world, had its own agenda. What they sought was more than a mere portrait. They sought a legacy, one that tied the past to the future in ways no one had expected. And as Cynthia stared at the photograph, the weight of her mother's gaze seemed to pierce through the very soul of the house, as if to say, "There is more here than you know." The unsettling truth hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and it was clear that Glenwood Hall's most dangerous secrets had yet to be uncovered. What started as an inquiry into a forgotten painting would soon unravel the very history of the place, revealing a legacy built on lies, love, and betrayal, and forcing Cynthia to face the darkest corners of her own heart. The soft flicker of candlelight barely illuminated the shadows of Glenwood Hall as the silence hung heavily in the air, each corner of the grand house seemingly holding its breath. Cynthia stood in the gallery, the weight of the past pressing against her chest as she gazed at the portrait her mother had painted. So much more than a mere image. It was a story, a secret, a life never fully told. Benedict Shaw's sudden arrival had shattered the stillness, his presence like a ripple in water, disturbing the fragile calm that had clung to the estate. As he revealed the purpose of his visit, Cynthia's world seemed to tilt on its axis. Lady Isabel Rutherford, her mother's forgotten friend, had been searching for the truth for decades. The thought that her mother had been more than just a shadow in the town's whispers, that she had a life, a legacy, was almost too much to bear. The storm outside intensified, its winds howling as if urging Cynthia to open the door to a past she had long tried to bury. The portraits in the gallery, once silent witnesses to the life that had unfolded within these walls, now seemed to breathe with new life. Shaw's words, his admiration for Eloise Brandt's artistry, felt like a revelation, as though the very brushstrokes on the canvas were a cry for recognition that had gone unheard for far too long. Yet it was not just about art. It was about truth, the truth that had been hidden, lost beneath layers of lies and silence. As Miss Marple watched the scene unfold, she knew that this was not just about a retrospective exhibition, but about giving Eloise the legacy she had been denied, and perhaps through that, granting closure to a story that had never been told. The letter from Lady Rutherford, a promise of letters from her father, brought yet another unexpected turn. The thought that Cynthia's father had fought for her, for the memory of her mother, was a bitter comfort. But it was not until Cynthia whispered her request to tell Lady Rutherford that her mother's name had not been forgotten, that the full weight of the moment hit her. The ghosts of the past were not just memories to be locked away. They were truths that would find their way to the surface, no matter how much one tried to ignore them. And as they stood in the gallery, the portrait of Eloise now taking on a different light, no longer haunted, but proud. It was clear that the house had been waiting for this moment. The teacup left untouched, the paused conversations, the unspoken words. Glenwood Hall had always known the truth. It had only needed someone brave enough to seek it. And now, that someone was Cynthia, who had uncovered a legacy far deeper than she ever imagined. But with each revelation, the question remained, was she truly ready to face the darkness that still lingered? The part of her mother's life that had been erased? Or would the ghosts of Glenwood Hall continue to haunt her, waiting for their final reckoning? As the days grew colder, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for some final revelation to stir the stillness that had settled over Glenwood Hall. Miss Marple, with her sharp instincts, had noticed it before anyone else. The untouched teacups on the sideboard, one stained faintly with lipstick, the other untouched and still steaming. It was a detail too small to be ignored, a sign that something was amiss. Her quiet footsteps echoed down the corridors as she made her way to Lady Lavinia's room, her mind already piecing together the fragments of a mystery that had yet to fully reveal itself. When she knocked and received no answer, a cold unease crept into her chest. The tray of tea still warm, and the untouched biscuit was small, but telling signs of someone who had no intention of returning to it. As she entered the room, the sight that greeted her was one she had feared. Lady Lavinia, still in her chair, eyes closed, but the tranquility on her face belied the darkness of her final decision. The letter in her lap, addressed to Cynthia, spoke volumes in its mere presence. But Miss Marple's practiced eye did not let her linger over it. Instead, she noticed the faint scent of lavender, mingled with something medicinal, a subtle but distinct aroma that whispered of the sleeping powder beside her, enough to take away more than just a few restless nights. Miss Marple's thoughts turned quickly. This wasn't an accident. It was a choice, a decision to leave the world on her terms. She called for Elsie, instructing her to keep the news of Lady Lavinia's death a secret until Cynthia was informed. In the garden where Cynthia returned from her walk, her eyes holding the weight of unspoken thoughts, Miss Marple's somber approach was the final piece of the puzzle. When the news of her grandmother's passing reached her, there was no outward shock, just a quiet stillness, as if Cynthia had been expecting this moment her entire life. Her fingers tightened around her sketchpad, the only link to a life she had tried so desperately to escape. As Miss Marple spoke of the letter Lady Lavinia had left, Cynthia's emotions remained tightly controlled, the walls of her heart seemingly impenetrable. But even beneath that stoic exterior, Miss Marple could sense the unraveling of years of buried truths. She was never cruel, Cynthia whispered, but she was never kind either. It was a painful admission, one that echoed the fractured relationship between mother and daughter, a relationship built on silence and secrets. Yet Miss Marple understood more than most. The walls that Lady Lavinia had built for herself were not only to protect her but to trap her, a prison of her own making. Later, in the privacy of her room, Cynthia opened the letter her grandmother had left for her, and its contents were as stark and raw as the truth it revealed. It was a confession, a final attempt to make peace with the years of regret and silence that had marked her life. "I lived a life ruled by silence," it began. "I loved a man I couldn't hold, feared a woman I couldn't outshine, and buried the truth because I thought dignity mattered more than honesty." The words, though simple, were laced with the weight of a lifetime of choices, and Cynthia's eyes welled with unshed tears. But it was the final sentence that truly struck her to the core. "You have made me see what truly matters." It was a small moment of clarity in a life clouded by fear and denial, and though it could never undo the damage, it was perhaps the first step toward the kind of peace that had eluded Lady Lavinia all her life. Yet as the mystery unraveled, Cynthia knew there was more to this story than she could yet understand. How many secrets still lingered in the shadows of Glenwood Hall? What else had been buried in silence, waiting to be uncovered? And most of all, what truths would Cynthia herself have to confront before she could finally break free of the legacy that had defined her family for generations? 3 days after Lady Lavinia's death, a strange shift settled over Glenwood Hall, as if the house itself had exhaled a long-held breath, releasing years of secrets and sorrow into the air. The walls, once heavy with the weight of untold stories, seemed to stand a little taller, their silence less suffocating. The stairs no longer creaked as they had. The curtains let in more light, and for the first time in years, there was a tangible sense of freedom within the old halls. Cynthia, however, found herself lost in quiet, solitary routines. She cleaned not with desperation, but with a methodical calm, her movements measured as she dusted forgotten frames, sorted through forgotten drawers, and unearthed memories in old boxes. In one of them, hidden beneath layers of dust and forgotten history, she discovered the music box. Its porcelain body, adorned with delicate violets and gold leaf, was no bigger than a teacup, its quiet beauty somehow more haunting than comforting. Tucked away in the velvet-lined drawer, the box had no key, until now. Cynthia found it, hidden within a false bottom, a tiny brass key tarnished with age, but still functional. She turned it, and a soft, familiar melody began to play. A lullaby in French, its notes stirring something deep within her. She had heard it before, though the memory eluded her, perhaps as a child, before time had fully shaped her memories. Miss Marple appeared in the doorway, as the song played, her sharp eyes immediately recognizing the tune. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice steady with the kind of quiet, knowing that only Miss Marple possessed. Cynthia, slightly startled, replied, "In the writing desk. It belonged to Lavinia, but I think it's much older than that." The detective moved across the room, her gaze softening as she listened. "It's Eloise's lullaby," she said, with a knowing glance. It was said that Eloise Brandt herself composed it, a gift for her daughter during their brief time in Paris. Cynthia blinked, puzzled. "You know about this?" Miss Marple nodded, her gaze distant for a moment as if recalling something long buried. "Only from village whispers," she answered, her voice tinged with quiet mystery. But who would believe such things? After all, who writes lullabies in the shadows? They stood in silence, the melody winding down to its final fading notes, the room now heavy with the weight of untold stories. Cynthia, still mesmerized by the music box, opened it to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside, there was a small brittle note, its ink faint and barely legible. Carefully, she unfolded it, feeling as if she were unearthing a secret too personal to be exposed. The message, scrawled in hurried handwriting, read, "For her, when she's ready to know me, not as a secret, but as a mother." Beneath the words, a pressed violet, and the faint impression of a thumbprint in blue paint, marked the paper with a ghostly presence. Cynthia's breath caught in her throat. "She left this for me," she whispered, the words barely audible. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm, her touch comforting yet full of understanding. "She never stopped being your mother, Cynthia," she said quietly. "Not even in hiding." They stood together, the weight of the moment settling in, both of them knowing that what had once been hidden could never truly be buried again. The past, like the music, could not be silenced. It was a part of them now, as inevitable as the rhythm of a lullaby, long forgotten but never entirely gone. Cynthia's voice broke the stillness of the room as she questioned, "Why hide something so gentle?" Miss Marple, her eyes deep with the kind of wisdom only time could offer, replied, "Because Lavinia saw love as a weakness." Her words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, as if each one carried the weight of a lifetime of silent battles fought within the walls of Glenwood Hall. "Lavinia controlled everything here," Miss Marple continued, her gaze flicking to the corners of the room, as if she could see the ghosts of the past lingering there. Even how Eloise was remembered. Cynthia, feeling the weight of the music box in her hands, turned it over slowly, the porcelain cool against her fingertips. "Not anymore," she whispered, the resolve in her voice steadying, as she placed the box in a place of reverence, on the mantel beside the portrait of Eloise. It felt like a symbolic reunion, the past and present finally acknowledging one another in the quietest of ways. Later that day, Miss Marple took a walk through the village, the air crisp with late spring, carrying the scent of new growth and old secrets. She stopped by the church, spoke with Reverend Clement, then made her way to the grocer's shop, a place where, no matter the day, the latest gossip was always tucked between apples and stale bread. "Is it over now?" everyone asked. "Is the mystery done?" Miss Marple smiled, her response as quiet as it was inevitable. "No murder ever quite ends, you know. Only the silence does." When she returned to Glenwood Hall, she found Cynthia sitting by the gallery's grand fireplace, a half-finished canvas on the table before her. It was a portrait in progress, a girl and a woman seated, not facing the viewer, but looking at something just beyond the edge of the frame, something unseen, something unknown. It was not yet clear who they were, but Miss Marple knew instinctively. Cynthia was painting the future, and it was a future still shaped by the echoes of the past. The next morning, the garden at Glenwood Hall seemed to call out to them, as if time itself had stood still within its walls. The roses, wild and untamed, tangled in their growth, their petals appearing as though they had always bloomed this way, without order or structure, a riot of color and chaos. The old folly, now little more than a half-ruined structure, swallowed by ivy, peeked through the greenery, its stone walls whispering forgotten tales. Cynthia had always loved this garden, the place where she could sit for hours with her sketchpad in hand, her thoughts lost to the strokes of charcoal. But today the garden felt different, like it was no longer just a place of beauty, but a doorway into something far deeper, far older. As Cynthia knelt by the fountain, her hair catching the sunlight, and turning to copper, Miss Marple watched her carefully. She wasn't drawing this time. No, this was something far more substantial, something more than just a memory. It was a vision, a moment captured not in the future, but from the past, a memory so vivid that it seemed to breathe. "It's strange," Cynthia said quietly, her voice distant. "How much I never knew about her, about myself." Miss Marple said nothing, knowing that Cynthia was seeing the ties that bound the generations, the truths that lingered long after the people had gone. "It's like time froze here," Cynthia continued, her voice soft with a strange reverence. "Like the garden has never changed. Like it's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Miss Marple asked, her words gentle but sharp with curiosity. "For someone to see it," Cynthia answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "For someone to remember." The weight of her words settled heavily in the air, and Miss Marple, feeling a wave of something akin to grief, looked at the garden through Cynthia's eyes. She thought of Eloise, of all the lives lost and forgotten in these halls, lives that had slipped through the cracks of time, now buried beneath the weight of their own silence. "There's a lot we don't understand," Miss Marple said softly, sitting down on the stone bench beside Cynthia. "But there is one thing I do know. The garden remembers. It keeps what we forget." Cynthia, lost in the sketch in her hands, turned it slowly, her gaze lingering on the unfinished image of the woman and child sitting side by side, staring not at the world before them, but at the memories they carried within. "Do you ever wonder," Cynthia asked, her voice trembling slightly, "what would have happened if we hadn't found the truth?" Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes gazing into the distance, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think," she said softly, "that the truth has a way of finding us, even when we're not looking for it." Cynthia's gaze lingered on the sketch, the quiet, unspoken answer hanging between them like a breath they hadn't yet released. The fog hung thick over the village of Marley Combe, as though the earth itself were unwilling to release its secrets, each tendril curling like a forgotten whisper. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the garden, her gaze fixed on the old iron gate, which had always remained locked, a silent sentinel to a forgotten corner of the estate. It was a place that had been lost to time, a patch of overgrown land beyond the boundary, seemingly insignificant yet inexplicably compelling. The mist clung stubbornly to the earth, refusing to lift as if it had its own memories to protect. Today, however, there was an unsettling stillness in the air, as though the fog was hiding something that could not yet be revealed. Cynthia had been away most of the day, lost in errands around the village, but Miss Marple had remained behind, roaming the house like a woman waiting for an inevitable event, though she could not yet name it. The house itself seemed charged with tension, a quiet, almost palpable anticipation that weighed on her chest. Her footsteps echoed softly as she crossed the garden, the morning dew dampening the earth beneath her feet. The stone gate loomed before her now, its iron bars thick with ivy, the rusted lock untouched for years. She knew this gate, had passed it countless times, but today it felt different. It was as if the gate, hidden so far from the rest of the house, had been waiting for someone to discover its purpose. Reaching into her coat pocket, Miss Marple retrieved a small tarnished key, its metal cool to the touch, once forgotten beneath the floorboards in the old library. She had tucked it away, its significance unclear, but now, standing before the gate, the weight of it seemed undeniable. As she inserted the key into the lock, the metal groaned with age, but the gate gave way easily, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Beyond it lay a path, narrow and winding, shrouded by thick trees and neglected hedgerows. The air here was colder, heavier, and the ground beneath her boots soft, almost as though the earth itself was absorbing the weight of the years. There was an unnatural silence that hung here, deeper than the mere absence of sound, a silence that felt ancient, as though it belonged to a time long buried beneath the surface. With every step the air grew heavier, thick with the weight of something hidden just beyond reach. As Miss Marple moved further down the path, the stillness pressed in around her, the moss-covered stones beneath her boots muffling her steps as she drew closer to something forgotten, left behind by all but the passage of time itself. The silence seemed to grow louder, more oppressive, until it felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the truth to surface once more. When she stopped, it was not by choice. Something had drawn her there, a pull she could not resist. In that moment, she realized that whatever lay ahead would change everything. For the truth, as it always does, had a way of finding its way to the light, no matter how long it had been buried in the shadows. The clearing before her was shrouded in an eerie quiet, the kind of silence that felt as though the very earth was holding its breath. In the center stood an old stone pedestal, worn and weathered by the relentless passage of time, its surface cracked and marred by years of neglect. A small plaque, barely visible beneath layers of grime, clung to the top. Miss Marple crouched before it, her fingers brushing away the dirt as the faded inscription slowly came into view. To the one who remembers, may they carry the weight of the past, and make peace with what is lost. A shiver ran down her spine as the words settled in her mind. They were cryptic, unsettling, but she knew with a certainty that resonated deep within her, that this pedestal, like the gate she had passed through to get here, had not been placed here by chance. This was no forgotten corner of the world. This place had been deliberately concealed, hidden away for reasons Miss Marple was only beginning to understand. As her eyes swept over the clearing, she felt the strange, unshakable sense that something had been left here, something important, something lost, buried beneath the weight of time. And yet it felt as though it was waiting for her. The very air around her seemed thick with a secret that had never been fully spoken, a mystery tangled in shadows that had long been left untouched. It was then she heard it, footsteps, soft but deliberate, approaching from behind. Startled, she turned, her heart quickening. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Cynthia. Her face was pale, drawn, as though she had been running, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. "I knew you'd come here," Cynthia said, her voice shaky but certain. "I could feel it." Miss Marple stood slowly, brushing her hands free of dirt as she straightened. "I think I've found something important, Cynthia," she said, her voice low with the weight of discovery. "Something that's been hidden for far too long." Cynthia stepped forward, her gaze moving slowly over the clearing, as if she were seeing it for the first time, her eyes searching, questioning. "I always wondered what was beyond that gate," she murmured, "but I never had the courage to find out." Miss Marple's eyes softened as she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. Sometimes the courage comes when we least expect it. Cynthia's eyes flickered to the pedestal, narrowing as she studied it. "What is this place?" she asked, a hint of disbelief creeping into her voice. "It's part of the house's history," Miss Marple replied, her words measured, deliberate. "A place where something was hidden, something that's been waiting for the right person to uncover it." Cynthia's gaze flickered between the pedestal and Miss Marple, a question lingering in her eyes. "Do you think we'll ever know everything about my mother? About all of it?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her expression one of quiet understanding. "Some things may never be fully understood," she said softly. "But the truth is like the sun. Even when hidden behind clouds, it always shines through eventually." Cynthia moved closer to the pedestal, her fingers grazing the cracked stone as she stood there, lost in thought. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still around them. Then, she turned to Miss Marple, her voice steady, resolute. "Do you think I'm ready now?" she asked. "Ready for what?" Miss Marple asked, her brow furrowing slightly. "Ready to let go of the past," Cynthia said quietly. "To finally let it rest, and move forward." Miss Marple placed a hand on Cynthia's shoulder, her touch both comforting and firm. As her gaze drifted back toward the gate, now open to the world beyond, she felt a subtle shift in the air. The past had been unlocked, set free, and with it, the truth that had been hidden for so long. The garden, the gate, and the pedestal had all served their purpose. The mystery was over, and now, it was time for the garden to grow again, untangled from the vines of the past. The following week, the atmosphere around Glenwood Hall seemed to change. A soft, almost imperceptible shift in the air. It was as though the house had finally exhaled, after holding its breath for so many years. The secrets that had once clung to its walls were now lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of peace, a lightness that had been absent for far too long. Cynthia, too, had changed. She spent more time outside now, in the garden, the very same garden, where her mother had once sought peace, where she had nearly lost herself in the search for truth. But now, the garden had become something different. It was no longer a place weighed down by sorrow or shadows. It was a place of rebirth, where new growth had begun to take root. The past, for all its darkness, had finally given way to the light of understanding. And in that garden, Cynthia found herself not just healing, but starting anew. The truth, like the garden, had begun to bloom once more. The morning air was thick with the promise of change, and Miss Marple felt it in the very soil beneath her feet. The garden, once a haunting reflection of the past, now breathed with a quiet kind of hope. Its petals, once wilted and shadowed, seemed to stretch toward the light with newfound purpose. Cynthia, who had long carried the weight of her mother's unresolved mysteries, now moved among the flowers with a grace that spoke of release, of shedding the burdens that had once defined her. Miss Marple watched with a knowing gaze, as Cynthia's hands worked the earth, her fingers pulling weeds with care, planting seeds with intention. It was as though each movement she made was a testament to the growth she'd undergone, not just in the garden, but within herself. The garden was no longer a place to hide from the shadows of the past. It was a place to nurture what could be, a place where secrets like the flowers themselves could bloom into something beautiful. As the morning sun filtered through the branches, casting its golden glow over the scene, Cynthia looked up from her task, her face lit with a quiet kind of joy. "They're ready," she said, her voice softer now, free from the trembling it once carried. Miss Marple smiled, the edges of her eyes crinkling with approval. "You've given them everything they needed," she said, "just as you've given yourself." The air seemed to hold its breath as they stood together, the weight of the past now slipping from Cynthia's shoulders, replaced by something far lighter. There was still much to be uncovered, of course, unanswered questions, unspoken truths, but they were no longer burdens. The day felt like the first breath of a new beginning, not just for Cynthia, but for the house itself, the walls that had once echoed with secrets now resonating with the quiet hum of possibility. But as the day wore on, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the past, though it had been left behind, wasn't quite finished with them. Later that afternoon, as Cynthia prepared dough in the kitchen, humming softly to herself, Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to a letter that had arrived earlier, its seal bearing the emblem of the Gainsworth Trust. She recognized it immediately, and her heart quickened as she picked it up, sensing something important within its folds. Cynthia glanced over, her expression light, unaware of the weight the letter carried. "It's from Lady Rutherford," she said, her voice bright. "I think it's about the exhibition, but I haven't opened it yet." Miss Marple's fingers moved carefully to break the seal, unfolding the letter with quiet deliberation. As her eyes scanned the words, a slow smile spread across her face. But there was something more, something that made her pulse quicken. Cynthia's curiosity flared, and she leaned in. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice laced with anticipation. Miss Marple looked up, her eyes glinting with the knowledge of something both thrilling and unsettling. "It seems," she began, her voice taking on a new tone, "that Lady Rutherford has finally decided to include Eloise Brant in the upcoming exhibition. But there's more." Cynthia's brows furrowed, as she watched Miss Marple, her heart beginning to race. "More," she echoed. Miss Marple nodded, handing her the letter with an air of quiet revelation. "It seems," she said, "that Lady Rutherford has uncovered something about your mother's past, something even she didn't know. Eloise's paintings, including several never-before-seen works, are being returned to their rightful places. They're considering including your mother's name alongside the greatest artists of her time." Cynthia's hands trembled as she held the letter, her mind reeling from the revelation. She had never known, had never imagined that her mother's work could hold such significance. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of pride, of recognition, that had eluded her for so long. "I never knew," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never knew she mattered." Miss Marple's gaze softened as she placed a gentle hand on Cynthia's shoulder. "She always mattered," she said quietly. "And now you do too." Cynthia's face, a mixture of disbelief and wonder, crumpled slightly as the truth washed over her. For a moment she sat there, the letter still clutched in her hands, unsure of what to feel. But Miss Marple's calm smile reassured her, a reminder that some answers, no matter how late, were always worth waiting for. As the warmth of the kitchen settled around them, the oven door closing with a soft sigh, the future seemed to unfold, unpredictable, but full of promise. And just like the garden outside, Cynthia was finally ready to grow. The day of the exhibition dawned, soft winds carrying the scent of fresh earth and spring's first blooms through the open windows of Marley. The grand gallery of the Gainsworth Trust was alive with the whispers of anticipation, a hush that clung to the air like an unspoken secret, as Eloise Brant's long-lost legacy prepared to step into the light. Her name, once forgotten by time, now rested at the forefront of an event that held the power to transform history. The gallery buzzed with the quiet hum of visitors, curators, and critics, unaware that today would be the day they would bear witness to something more than just art. It was the resurrection of a soul, long buried beneath layers of obscurity. Cynthia, standing by Miss Marple's side, felt the weight of it all. She had dressed with care, her lavender gown a delicate nod to a color that had always stirred something deep within her, yet one she had always shied away from. The moment she stepped into the gallery, she knew this was no longer just a painting she was about to reveal. It was her own heart, her own past, unfolding in front of strangers. But still, there was an uncertainty in her eyes. "Do you think I'm ready?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper, barely rising above the hum. "They'll see me as the daughter of a woman they never knew, a shadow of someone who never had the chance to shine." Miss Marple, as ever, stood beside her with the quiet wisdom only time could grant, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of Cynthia's doubt. "Yes, they will see you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But that is the gift your mother left you. This is your chance to give her a voice, to let her story be heard. You don't need to be ready, Cynthia. You only need to begin." As the doors to the gallery swung open, the world seemed to pause, every gaze drawn to the unveiled portraits that lined the walls. The light that bathed each canvas seemed to soften time itself, casting the images in a sacred glow, as if the paintings themselves were breathing once again. And then there it was, Eloise Brandt's portrait, revealed after decades of silence. The eyes of the woman in the painting locked onto the visitors, with a quiet, knowing intensity, her face half captured in a smile that was both timeless and sorrowful, as if she knew this moment would one day come, but perhaps not in the way she had hoped. Beside it stood another portrait, a striking yet tender rendition of Cynthia, her likeness captured in the same strokes that defined her mother's face, but with something more, a vulnerability, a promise of something yet to unfold. Cynthia stood still for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, her gaze moving from her mother's portrait to the one of her own. The room fell silent once again, as if the weight of the revelation held everyone in its grasp. Miss Marple's voice broke through the silence, her tone a soft invitation. "Would you like to speak, Cynthia?" It took a moment, but Cynthia finally nodded, her breath catching in her throat. Stepping forward, she stood in front of the two portraits, her hand trembling as it hovered over the painting of Eloise. The crowd seemed to fade into the background, as she gathered herself, the weight of a lifetime of questions pressing down on her. "I never knew her," Cynthia began, her voice fragile but determined, each word a fragile thread connecting her to a past she had never fully understood. "All I had were the whispers of stories, the fragments of a woman who never had the chance to share her truth. But today I stand here, not as her daughter, but as the voice she never had the chance to be. Today her story is mine to tell." The words hung in the air, reverberating through the gallery, and for the first time in years, Cynthia felt the past lifting from her shoulders, leaving her not with the weight of mystery, but with the promise of a future where she could finally breathe freely. As the first rays of dawn stretched over the hills beyond Glenwood Hall, the estate seemed to breathe with a new energy, one that had been dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Cynthia stood on the gallery's marble floor, surrounded by the vibrant portraits of her mother, Eloise Brandt. These paintings, once hidden away in the shadows of time, now glowed in the soft, reverent light, telling stories that had been silenced for far too long. It was as if each stroke of the brush held secrets, each color a memory, and each gaze a whisper from the past, urging Cynthia to listen, to understand. Eloise's face, framed in the intricate details of her artistry, was a testament to a woman whose spirit was now alive through her work. But it was more than just the art, it was the legacy that had unknowingly shaped Cynthia's life. As she stood there, the weight of all those unanswered questions, the ones that had plagued her for so long, began to settle, not as a burden, but as something she could finally comprehend. It was as though the portraits, the gallery, and the very walls of Glenwood Hall had been waiting for this moment, for Cynthia to stand and claim the history that had once been so elusive. She took a steadying breath, her eyes meeting the gaze of Eloise's painting, her heart pounding with the realization that the mother she never knew had left her the greatest gift of all, a story, a truth, and a sense of belonging. Miss Marple, always the quiet anchor beside her, nodded with understanding, her presence grounding, as if to say that this was not an ending, but a beginning. Cynthia's voice trembled as she spoke, her words soft yet filled with conviction. "I never knew her, not truly, but today I can finally see her for who she was, more than just the strokes of paint on canvas, more than a name lost to time. She was a woman, a mother, an artist, and now I can honor her as she deserves." As the final words left her lips, the room once filled with the buzz of quiet admiration, now stood in solemn silence. The applause that followed was not just for the art, but for the woman who had found the courage to give voice to her past, to reclaim the story that had always been hers. The gallery, once merely a space to display beauty, had transformed into a sanctuary of truth, where the echoes of history were no longer silenced, and where a daughter could finally find peace in the truth of her mother's legacy. Later, as the last of the guests left and the doors were gently closed, Cynthia remained in the center of the room, her fingers lightly grazing the painted frames. The house, the grounds, and even the very air seemed to pause, as if holding its breath, waiting for her to finish what she had started, to tell the story that had been hidden for so long. And in that moment, Cynthia realized that Glenwood Hall, once a place of sorrow, had now become a home where the past and present had found their place together, where the rebirth of Eloise Brant's name had brought with it a sense of healing and hope. It was no longer a house of ghosts. It was a home where the truth had been allowed to breathe, and for the first time in years, the air felt full of possibility, of new beginnings, and of a future that had been reclaimed from the shadows. As the first light of dawn gently bathed the hills beyond Glenwood Hall, Cynthia stood at the gate, her gaze lost in the rising mist that clung to the earth like a secret just waiting to be revealed. The shadows of the past, once so heavy, seemed to stir in the morning light, whispering questions that had haunted her for years. "Do you think the past will ever stop chasing me, Miss Marple?" she asked softly, her voice barely rising above the hum of the early morning. "Will I ever stop feeling as though I'm carrying something that doesn't belong to me, something I can't put down?" Miss Marple, standing beside her with the grace of someone who had seen it all, chuckled in a way that felt both reassuring and wise. "Cynthia," she said, her voice like a gentle breeze, "the past doesn't haunt you. It merely follows you. It's like a shadow. It's always there, but it's only as heavy as you allow it to be. What you carry with you, you have the power to lighten." Cynthia's breath caught as she turned to face her, her heart heavy with unspoken words. "I don't know how to make it lighter," she admitted, her voice trembling. Miss Marple's smile was serene, her eyes twinkling with a quiet understanding. "You already have," she said, her words like a balm to a soul that had long been torn between the past and the present. "By accepting it, by allowing yourself to be who you truly are, not who others tried to make you believe you should be. That, my dear, is the first step toward freedom." Cynthia's fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, her eyes downcast as though she were searching for something hidden within herself. "I never thought I'd be free," she murmured, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Not truly." Miss Marple turned to her, her expression warm with the wisdom of years. "You've always been free, Cynthia," she said gently. "You just didn't know it until now." In the silence that followed, a quiet understanding passed between them. Two women who had come to know each other deeply, their connection now more than just words. There were no more questions, no more mysteries to unravel, just the soft hum of life itself moving forward, like the birds that sang in the distance, the steady march of time that could never be reversed, but could always be shaped anew. As the day wore on, Cynthia felt the weight of the past lifting. The gallery was no longer filled with the whispers of secrets long buried. The house no longer felt like a place of sorrow. Glenwood Hall, for the first time in years, felt like a home, a sanctuary where the past and present had found peace. Later, as the evening drew in and the last of the guests had left, Cynthia stood in the center of the gallery, her fingers brushing over the frames of the paintings that had once held her mother's secrets. Eloise Brant's portrait, which had once seemed so stern, now looked back at her with quiet understanding, as though even the woman in the painting had come to terms with the truth. "I think she would have liked this," Cynthia whispered to Miss Marple, who stood quietly nearby, watching her with a knowing smile. "I believe she would have," Miss Marple replied softly, her eyes reflecting a deep sense of peace that only time and truth could bring. As they stood there, the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving behind only the quiet certainty that the final curtain had indeed fallen. The mystery had been solved, the past had been acknowledged, and the truth, at long last, had been freed. Cynthia had uncovered her mother's story, and in doing so, had uncovered her own. And now, with the weight of unanswered questions lifted, there was nothing left but the peaceful hum of a life that would continue to move forward, unburdened by the shadows of the past. It was a new beginning, and for the first time, Cynthia felt truly free. Cynthia stood before the mantel, her gaze lingering on the two portraits that hung side by side, her mother, Eloise, and herself. The weight of their eyes, captured forever in time, felt heavier than ever. "I don't know if it's peace," she whispered, her voice trembling with a strange mix of sorrow and relief. "But I'm finally ready to stop running from it. From her. From myself." Miss Marple, observing her with quiet wisdom, rose from her chair, and walked over to stand beside Cynthia. Her movements were slow, but purposeful, her frail frame betraying none of the sharpness in her mind. She studied the portraits, the silence between them thick with meaning. "The past never truly leaves us," Miss Marple said softly, her voice barely a murmur. "It becomes part of us, a shadow that follows, but also shapes us. It's in what we do, what we choose, who we become." Cynthia nodded, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Finally she exhaled a quiet breath. "I think I've always known it," she said, "but I never truly understood it until now." They stood together for a long moment, absorbing the stillness that surrounded them, the soft glow of the room, the shadows that seemed to breathe life into the air. The paintings, now seen through new eyes, no longer felt like relics of a haunting past. They felt like pieces of a story, their stories, that had at last found their rightful place. The chime of the doorbell echoed through the house, breaking the quiet. Miss Marple turned to Cynthia with a knowing smile. "I believe that's the last guest arriving," she said, her voice filled with gentle certainty. Cynthia smiled faintly, her fingers resting on the edge of the mantel. "The last chapter, I suppose," she murmured. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she nodded. "But every end is a beginning, my dear." Cynthia's expression softened as she turned to face Miss Marple. "What will you do now, Jane?" she asked, her curiosity piqued by the enigma that was her companion. Miss Marple chuckled, her tone light and filled with fondness. "Oh, I imagine I'll continue with my knitting," she said. "Perhaps I'll visit a few more villages, uncover a few more mysteries, but for now I think I'll enjoy the peace." Cynthia moved toward the door, and Miss Marple followed, both of them pausing in the quiet of the hallway. "Do you ever wonder, Jane, if the past is truly gone?" Cynthia's voice was softer now, tinged with an uncertainty that still clung to her. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes sparkled with quiet wisdom. "I believe the past is never truly gone," she replied, her words carrying a depth of understanding. "It lives on in us, in the choices we make, in the way we live, in the stories we choose to tell." Cynthia's lips curved into a smile, as she absorbed this truth. "Then I suppose," she said, her voice growing more assured, "we are the stories we tell." "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes gleaming with warmth. "We are the stories we tell." As the last guest arrived, the house once burdened with secrets, suffocated by the weight of unspoken truths, seemed to breathe freely for the first time in years. The portraits of Eloise and Cynthia hung side by side, no longer as symbols of fear or regret, but as reflections of women who had both been lost and found. As Miss Marple stood at the doorway, watching the soft mingling below, she knew this story, the story of Glenwood Hall, of Cynthia and her mother, would never truly end. It wouldn't live in the walls of the house, nor in the whispers of those who had once walked through it. It would live in the hearts of those who had the courage to remember, to face the truth, and to tell their own stories.